Hello and welcome back to the channel. We'll be doing another simple history video on overpowered weapons in history. It'll talk about so this tank, let me just, here is actually a 1,000 ton German tank, which was one of the most powerful tanks ever. I don't think they actually built it though. Anyway, let's get on with the video.
The Rata. Mega tank.
Yes. I think this is what I was talking about.
In the years leading up to World War II, Nazi Germany conducted a vast number of projects with the aim of developing new types of weapons that would bring them military supremacy over other nations. The majority of these designs as true innovations in the field of weapons
yeah, it's what I'm talking
were ahead
about.
of their time. The Germans called them Wunderwaffen, which translates to wonder weapons or miracle weapons. Some of these were successfully deployed to battlefields, while some progressed no further than the...
Now that is actually a large railgun, which was actually had to be transported by train. It was that big, and it was I think it's the size of a large house.
Board. Many projects resulted in magnificent machines of war, but many others turned out to be complete failures. The idea of building the largest tank in the history of warfare belonged to the batch of Hitler's wonder weapons. Hitler's army mainly fought on land, and they wanted a tank that would make these land battles easier to win.
Well, yeah, the sea battles wouldn't have been able to be possible because of the British supremacy, and air battles weren't as good because of the British supremacy.
The main feature of this new tank, its enormous size, surpassed everything made up to that point. In comparison, even the heaviest of tanks would have seemed like toys.
Yes.
Like all dictators of his time, Adolf Hitler was in love with weapons that could show off his military strength. When Hitler was at the peak of his power in 1942, he was presented with an idea to build the largest tank ever devised, designed by Edward Grote, a director of the famous Krupp Company.
I think it had 8 ship guns, and then it had the main turret, and then it had, it had then loads of machine guns.
Hitler was thrilled. The way he saw it, the tank's hair-raising appearance perfectly matched the image of the German army that he wanted to build. At the time, Porsche had started constructing a 188 metric ton heavy tank called the Maus,
which is, I think, the largest tank, which was before the Rata,
which was supposed to be the mighty bellwether of the German panzers. The Maus, however, was nothing compared to its bigger cousin, named the Rata, or the Rat.
Yes.
The Rata was part of a land battleships concept that was in research from the 1930s. The pioneering nation in this research was the Soviet Union, with a project known as the TG-5. Their idea was to build a multi-engine driven...
And it was basically just a massive ship on tracks. What the design was meant to do was bulldoze areas of land and then attack large platoons of soldiers and tank squadrons by themselves. And I think this tank could hold over 2,000 people in it.
Tank weighing 1,000 metric tons and armed with a 107mm main gun and 4 sub-turrets. One of the engineers working on the project was Edward Grote. Upon his return to Germany, Grote brought his own ideas on building a giant tank. He started working as a director of the Krupp Company, and in June 1942, he was given the opportunity to present his ideas to Hitler himself. The Führer showed great enthusiasm for the project and ordered further design studies.
And you can notice that on it, all the armour is sloped. Now, if you watch my other video, you'll see why that is.
Grote responded with a series of drawings as a base for the future project designated the Landcruiser P1000 Rata, or Landcruiser P1000 the Rat. Edward Grote outlined the weight of the Rata tank to be a staggering 1,000 metric tons. It was an enormous weight compared to...
I don't know what that is in American tons to you Americans. or Imperial tons if you also use that.
Any other tank at that time. The latest German tank coming out of the factories, the Tiger I, was only 54 tons.
Yes.
The Retta's armament set alone weighed 300 tons. The armor and frame weighed 200 tons, its track and propulsion engines 100 tons, and the rest was the weight of its ammunition and other miscellaneous parts. The thickness of the armor varied from 5.9 to 14.2 inches, or 100.
Which is thicker than most of the armour on tanks then anyway. And the anti-tank guns at the time wouldn't have been able to get through that at all. It was just too thick, and therefore it would have been brilliant to hold lots of men.
50 to 360 millimeters. The mammoth weight of the tank was followed by its huge dimensions. The Retta was projected to be 115 feet or 35 meters long.
And you can see there, it's just demolishing a house.
46 feet or 14 meters wide. With its gun facing forward, it became 128 feet or 39 meters in length. The height of the tank was 36 feet or 11 meters, which was proportionate to a 3-story building.
Yes.
The Retta was so huge that it even had its own lavatory system and a vehicle bay to hold 2 BMW R12 motorcycles, while it was projected to have a crew of 41 men. The dimensions and weight of the tank necessitated it to have very wide tracks to provide the proper distribution of pressure on the ground. The Retta was designed to have 6 tracks, each one 3.9 feet or 1.2 meters wide, 3 on each side of the chassis. Setting a 1,000-ton monster into motion would have been a challenging task, as it would have required about 12,000 kilowatts or 16,000 horsepower to move the tank. The first choice...
And that's to move it at a very slow pace. Never mind even at a pace to keep up with the rest of the army.
Propulsion was 2 MAN V12 Z32-44 24-cylinder diesel engines of 6,300 kilowatts or 8,400 horsepower, which were similar to those already in use by German U-boats. The alternative was to use 8 Daimler-Benz MB501 20-cylinder diesel engines of 1,500 kilowatts or 2,000 horsepower. These engines were used on German E-boats.
Yes.
Both of these solutions were projected to provide a top speed of 25 miles per hour, or 40 kilometers an hour. In reality, it would have been unlikely for the tank to achieve that speed due to the light.
It probably would have gone more 10 miles an hour, or 5 more likely, so it wouldn't really have gotten up to those speeds at all.
Suspension and transmission problems.
Oh, dang it.
Tank to achieve that speed due to the likely suspension and transmission problems. The intended armament of the tank was equally as impressive as its appearance. The Retta was equipped with several types of guns, 2 of which were the main 28-centimeter SK-C-34 naval guns. These guns were developed in the 1930s to be used on Scharnhorst-class battleships. Needless to say, they were extremely powerful.
They were also long-distance guns, so they actually had to modify them so that they could shoot more downwards, so that they could actually shoot things on the ground which were much smaller than them.
At a distance of 3 miles, the guns were capable of penetrating armor up to 17.7 inches thick. At a maximum elevation of 40 degrees, their range was an incredible 25.6 miles.
This is what I said.
As an extra gun, the Retta was armed with a KWK-44 L55 anti-tank gun. There are no records indicating whether this gun was planned to be positioned at the front with the main guns or on a separate turret on the opposite side of the tank. Other armaments included an unknown number of 20mm anti-aircraft guns and 15mm autocannons normally used on German aircraft. The frightening size of the Retta was the feature on which the entire project was based. Paradoxically,
and actually, it was meant to also be that it was not meant to go up against many foot soldiers, because the foot soldiers were just going to run away out of its way. So it was more used against aircraft that were flying over it, because it was an easy target to bomb, and then tanks that were on the ground.
Was the project's main drawback. First of all, there was no tank factory in Germany large enough to be capable of assembling such a huge vehicle armed with...
They would have to build an entire new factory.
...naval guns. For that reason, a shipbuilding yard would have been required. Just building a prototype tank would have taken several months, using much of the yard's resources and space. This was a luxury the Germans could not afford at the time. Even if the tank was built, putting it into action would have been a logistical nightmare. Because of its massive weight of 1,000 tons, the Rata could not have been transferred to battlefields by railway. Using its own propulsion at a speed lower than 25 miles per hour, the Rata would have taken an eternity to arrive at the front. If it broke down along the way, it would have been impossible to tow.
Yes, it would have
taken another tank of the same size to accomplish the task. Also,
what would have to happen was, everywhere would have to be reinforced so the tank could go through. Everywhere would have to be redone, basically. And they didn't have the resources or the time to actually get it to places. And even if they could put it on a train, it would still take an eternity because trains don't run straight up to the front unless they're actively building them at the front, which is something they did in World War I, but not World War II, because World War II they were moving much more.
Because of its weight, the Rata could not have used roads or bridges without destroying them. The only favorable characteristic was the tank's high ground clearance of 6 feet.
Yes.
It would have allowed it to simply cross through a river. In the end, the Rata might have been considered a mighty tank, but it also would have been a remarkably easy target. The Rata's thick armor might have been a challenge for the Allied tanks, but not for the Allied
aircraft
bombers. Despite the heavy armor, it could not have withstood bombardments from the air. Being a gigantic and slow vehicle would have made it a perfect target for aerial attacks. The Rata was a huge, powerful, but ultimately impractical weapon. When the idea of building the tank appeared in 1942, the German industry was already overexerted by the war effort.
And as well, because it was an easy target, it meant that in theory, it would be destroyed almost as soon as it got out of the factory if there was Allied bombings nearby.
Spending valuable time and resources on building the largest tank in the world would have impeded that same effort for no significant results. That's why the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, canceled the project in early 1943, before it even entered the production phase. The Rata remained just another of Hitler's great fantasies. As German General Heinz Guderian wrote in his autobiography, Hitler's fantasy led him into the realm of the gigantic.
Yes. This is what I was talking about earlier.
The Schwerer Gustav, rail supergun, World War II. The Schwerer...
And of course, these are often going to be German from World War II, because Hitler just had a weird fantasy with large, powerful weapons. He also actually tried to train a group of dogs, which didn't go well, to communicate with humans and be like spies.
Gustav was the largest artillery gun ever made. Before the Second World War had started,
and it was actually made. This is an actual picture of that gun to this day. This is how it looks. K5 guns fired on American forces in Italy in 1944. It was created in 1941. And just look at the size of it. It was its own train. That's how big it was.
Started, Hitler required a devastating weapon for the invasion of France that could destroy the Maginot Line, penetrating its several layers of concrete and steel.
Yes.
The Schwerer Gustav was designed in 1934 by the German arms manufacturer Krupp. This giant railway gun weighed 1,350 tons and had an overall length of 47.3 meters.
It was actually one of the largest weapons ever to be produced, and it was made to attack beaches mostly and to defend beaches.
For 155 feet 2 inches. It was mounted on a railway chassis running on specially constructed tracks and had to be disassembled and assembled to set up. Even a set of outer tracks were required for the cranes to achieve this. Its barrel length was 32.5 meters or 1.
Which you might remember is similar to the size of the tank before.
Barrel length was 32.5 meters or 106 feet 8 inches and could only move up or down at an elevation of 48 degrees with horizontal targeting achieved via curved tracks. The weapon caliber was 80 centimeters or 31 inches, and the heavy
It was one of the largest bullets ever produced alone.
concrete piercing or high explosive shells weighed 7 tons, making them the largest and heaviest shells of any artillery piece in the world. The gun could fire over a range of 47 kilometers or 29 miles. After a number of shells were fired, the barrel would wear away and need replacing. The artillery gun
I
required
think the barrel needed replacing every 5 shots. So if you were doing a large mission, you could have like 2 barrels, spare replacement barrels. And they, being 36 meters in themselves, required their own railway car.
a staggering number of crew. 250 crewmen were required to assemble the gun, which took 3.5 days, while 2,500 crewmen were needed to lay the tracks. Flak battalions were also a necessity to protect the gun from air attacks, as it was highly visible due to its size. The
And quite unreliable because of its barrel issue.
Schwerer Gustav would be constructed throughout the 30s, but it would not enter service until 1941, therefore missing the French invasion. The gun would be transported to the Eastern Front and used at the siege of Sevastopol, where 4,000 men were required to set it up in position. It fired 300 shells at several enemy positions, including Soviet fortresses and ammunition magazines. After this, the Schwerer Gustav was
That would mean before it was transported to Leningrad, in that one siege, it would need 60 barrels. And that's just a barrel. Never mind anything else which may have gone wrong.
The Schwerer Gustav was transported to Leningrad, but the attack was cancelled. It is unknown whether there was a second gun constructed, or whether it was a nickname by the German artillery crew, but in 1942, Dora, as it became known, was operational at Stalingrad, but withdrawn by the Germans. During 1942, the Germans proposed to construct a new version of the gun, mounted on a self-propelled platform that could move without railway tracks, called the Land Cruiser P-1500 Monster.
But it wouldn't have moved that quick. I think it would move like 10 miles an hour at most. And that's if everything was correct with it.
However, the idea was eventually scrapped. As the war was coming to an end, the Schwerer Gustav, some sources say, was destroyed by the Germans to prevent capture on the 14th of April 1945, and its ruins studied by Soviet specialists.
Yes.
Overall, the Schwerer Gustav was quite an impractical weapon, demanding a large number of crew and setup to become operational. Yamato, super battleship. Largest
Japanese.
battleship in history. World War II. Design. The Yamato.
Now, some of these are from older videos, so they're a different sort of style, but they still work the same. These videos.
Class of battleships were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Second World War. This class were the heaviest battleships ever built.
Yes.
The Yamato-class battleships were not only the biggest of their kind, but were also the most powerful, with the largest amount of artillery mounted on a ship.
But then they were large enough to have that amount, while other ships weren't. You know, everyone thinks of the Dreadnoughts as one of the most powerful ships in the world, but everyone forgets about the Yamato. I can never pronounce their name.
The intention behind the design was to counter the numerical supremacy of the American Pacific Fleet.
Yes.
Since they didn't have the economic or industrial capacities to build a large quantity of ships, the Japanese decided to build larger battleships that could respond to numerous enemy ships at once. The Imperial Japanese Navy required a super heavy battleship that would be armed with 18.1-inch guns, and armor that could withstand the impact of 18-inch shells.
Which meant that it was extremely heavy and extremely expensive to make.
Furthermore, the ship had to have a top speed of 27 knots and a cruising range of 8,000 miles at a speed of 18 knots. After these requirements were received, the designers commenced development in 1935. After the initial plans were made, it was decided that the ship needed a displacement of 69,000 tons.
Which is the equivalent to 69 ratas, or about 60 of the railgun that we just looked at. That is a lot of them. Yeah.
The dimensions of the battleship were more than impressive. The overall length of the ship was 839 feet, with a beam width of 127.7 feet.
Yep.
The protection of the Yamato was equally impressive. The total weight of the armor was 22,534 tons, which was 1/3 of the entire displacement. The thickness of the armor varied from 8 inches to 16 inches, depending on the section. The deck armor was between 7.9 and 9.1 inches, while the gun turrets were protected with armor ranging from 9.5 to 20.
The gun turrets themselves were armoured. That shows you what they were actually going against the Americans.
26 inches. This armor was supposed to protect the Yamato from all Allied naval weapons. The Yamato class of battleships were powered by 4 steam engines, with 12 boilers and a total power of 150,000 shaft horsepower.
Which is a
Even
lot.
at maximum speed, the Yamato had great maneuverability. Ships in the Yamato class. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered 2 battleships of the Yamato class in 1936. The first one, Yamato, was built in the Kure shipyards, and the second, Musashi, in the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. Both
And actually, the guy who survived both atomic bombs worked for Mitsubishi.
shipyards had to be modified to handle the building of these enormous ships. The production of the ships were kept a secret, so large fences and canvas were placed around the docks to secure it from spies. As well as this, if a worker mentioned the project, they may have faced death.
Yeah.
The Navy ordered 2 more battleships.
The Japanese military were extremely secretive with a lot of their military ideas. So actually, death may seem extreme, but it could mean that your country is defeated. And there is nothing worse for a Japanese person than disgrace. And disgrace is often telling of governments, can be also telling of government secrets, so...
1939. The building of the first one, named Shinano, commenced production. But after the Battle of Midway, it was decided that it would be converted into an aircraft carrier. The last one, unofficially named Number 111, was never finished. Armament. The armament of the Yamato battleships was in accordance with the scale of the ship and its purpose. The primary armament consisted of 3 triple turrets with Type 94 46-centimeter guns. These 69.4-foot-long guns could fire a 3,219-pound projectile.
And they were some of the largest sea guns to ever be produced by the Japanese.
At a distance of 26.
Or many countries, actually. Many rich countries.
1 miles, with a rate of fire of 1.5 projectiles per minute. These were the largest and most powerful guns ever put on a ship. The entire weight of one turret was 2,774 tons, which equaled the weight of a fleet destroyer. The secondary armament consisted of 4 triple turrets with 155-millimeter guns. The anti-aircraft armament consisted of 6 twin-mounted Type 89 127-millimeter guns, mounted on the side of the ship above the 155-millimeter guns. Additionally, the Yamato had 8 triple-mounted Type 96 25-millimeter guns and 4 Type 93 13-millimeter guns on the bridge tower.
That's mostly for smaller patrol ships, though.
The Yamato even had a hangar below deck for storing 3 to 4 aircraft that were launched with 2 catapults. As the war progressed, the Yamato armament was modified with some guns removed and some added. The first modification came in July 1943, when radars were fitted to upgrade the ship's anti-aircraft.
And actually, the British invented radar and tried to hide it from the Germans.
Defense. At the same time, an additional 4 triple 25-millimeter guns were added to the weather deck. The second modification came in February 1944, when 2 155-millimeter side guns were removed, as they were of no use for anti-aircraft defense. These were replaced with an additional 6 twin-mounted Type 89 127-millimeter guns. The anti-aircraft defense was reinforced with 55 25-millimeter guns, some of which were triple-mounted.
Which made sense, because something that large and that slow would often be prone to aircraft from the American, what do you call it, aircraft carriers.
And some single-mounted. The final modification in November 1944, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, saw almost all single-mounted 25-millimeter guns replaced with triple-mounted guns, and 27 new 25-millimeter guns. After this, the Yamato... mounted guns, and 27 new 25mm guns. After this, the Yamato had 152 25mm guns in its armament. Fate.
I think they were all destroyed.
Even though Japan invested much of their capacities in building the Yamato-class battleships, their use during the war was underwhelming. The Japanese built the battleships to confront other ships on the sea, failing to foresee the development of aircraft as the most powerful weapon in the war.
Yes.
It could be said that Yamato was already obsolete by the time it was built. Battle of Midway. Both battleships of the class saw little action during the war. The Yamato was commissioned on December 15, 1941, and it was assumed as the flagship of the Japanese combined fleet. During the Battle of Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded its fleet from the Yamato's bridge. As the battle ended up disastrously for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Yamato was withdrawn to Japan, where it served as a headquarters ship, missing the Battle of Guadalcanal.
And actually, I think one of them was destroyed, and the Yamato has been turned into a museum.
Frequent and long periods of inactivity, it was nicknamed the Hotel Yamato. The Musashi took over the duty of flagship of the combined fleet on January 22, 1943, but it also saw little action. Both ships were used at the time as transport ships, as they could carry a large amount of troops. During these operations, both ships were being hit by U.S. submarines, forcing them to spend long periods of time in the truck shipyards for repairs. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The first big action for both ships came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of the war. On October 24, 1944, U.S. forces launched a massive air attack on the Japanese fleet. They concentrated their fire on Musashi, which couldn't withstand the amount of bombs and torpedoes launched at it. By the end of the day, it was sunk. On the following day, the Yamato used its 46-centimeter guns for the first and only time during the war, hitting an American carrier at a distance of 20 miles.
Which is actually quite impressive, because it had a top range of 21 miles, and was quite inaccurate at that range.
Battle. The Yamato suffered several bomb hits, but was not put in great danger. However, because of the danger of torpedo strikes, it was forced to leave the battle. Suicide mission. Operation Tengo. The final engagement of the Yamato was connected to the Allied invasion of Okinawa, which prompted the Japanese Navy to commence Operation Tengo, sending the entire...
They just had to try and attack, because they were so close to the main island that most people were afraid that they were going to actually invade.
Entire fleet to confront the U.S. Navy that was supporting the invasion. On April 6, 1945, the Yamato, with full magazines, sortied with 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers on a suicide mission. American codebreakers found out about the Japanese plans, so the U.S. Navy was prepared for the action that would follow. On April 7, a convoy of 10 ships, led by the Yamato, was attacked by 400 American airplanes. The Yamato withstood the bombs hitting its deck, but 11 torpedoes that hit the port side were more than it could take. After it rolled over to port, its aft magazines exploded, taking the Yamato to the bottom of the sea. 3,063 sailors were killed, and only 269 were saved.
Yeah.
The sinking of the battleship Yamato marked the end of the Japanese Imperial Navy. First World War tech. Zeppelins.
Actually, these were really bad when bombing London, because the anti-air guns would just burst a hole in them.
When a German aristocrat, Brigadier General Ferdinand Zeppelin, retired from the army in 1891, he devoted himself to the study of aeronautics.
Yes.
His proposals to the government for a lighter-than-air flying machine were rejected in 1894, but nevertheless, he would invest all his money into a company producing airships. By 1898, Zeppelin had constructed his first airship. The foundation of the airship were in its hydrogen-filled gas bags.
Which is what actually made the Hindenburg explode, because they used hydrogen, not helium. If they used helium, they would have been alright.
Carried inside a steel skeleton. It weighed 12 tons and contained 400,000 cubic feet of hydrogen, and was driven by propellers connected to a pair of 15-horsepower Daimler engines. When the Zeppelin LZ made its flight on July 2nd, 1900, the German government decided to fund the project. In March 1909, the German army purchased the Zeppelin Z1. These Zeppelins could reach a maximum speed of 136 kilometers per hour, and
which meant they could travel to countries very quickly and then just bomb them right there and then turn back. And they had a large bomb capacity, meaning that they could easily flatten an entire city.
Reach a height of 4,250 meters. They were armed with 5 machine guns and could carry 2,000 kilograms or 4,400 pounds of bombs. At the start of the war, Zeppelins were used in bombing raids. A Zeppelin was used to bomb Liège in Belgium on 6th August 1914, but had to make an emergency landing after encountering Belgian artillery fire. Over the next few weeks, 3 more Zeppelins were destroyed by ground forces. While the Zeppelins were an easy target to hit, the Germans continued to use them for attacks on France. In January 1915, 2 Zeppelin naval airships flew over the English coast, bombing Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn.
Actually, Great Yarmouth now, you can still see where the bombs hit.
Zeppelins would commence a bombing raid on London on May 31st, 1915, killing 28 people and injuring 60 more. Zeppelins were used at the Battle of Verdun in 1916, with 4 being brought down by ground fire, bringing in
you can actually see it in Valiant Hearts.
To their use on the Western Front. They continued to be used to attack the British home front, but British fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners became efficient at taking them down. 115 Zeppelins were used by the German military, with 77 destroyed or damaged beyond repair. After the war, Zeppelins were used for civilian transport.
And actually, the what do you call it? The Empire State Building, that little spike it has on top, was actually meant to dock airships before they went out of fashion.
The Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus was a super heavy tank. After the war, Panzerkampfwagen.
Yes, you heard about this in the when we talk about the DREADNOUGHTS.
8 Maus was a super heavy tank designed by the German forces during the Second World War. This was the heaviest tank ever built in human history. By the end of 1944, only 2 prototypes were completed, so the Maus never actually saw action in battle. The development of this super tank was primarily connected with Hitler's obsession to surpass the Allies in developing heavy tanks.
Yeah, I think it only weighed 188 tons compared to 1,000.
The task of designing a tank bigger and more powerful than any other was given to the leading German tank constructor, Ferdinand Porsche. In June 1942, Porsche presented Hitler with the idea of the VK100.01 Type 205 tank, which the Führer approved. This tank was to be 150 tons and was intended to use either a 150mm or a 128mm gun, with an additional 75mm gun and an MG-34 machine gun. The production of the tank hull, turret, and armament was assigned to Krupp, while the assembly was to be constructed in the Alket factory. At the time,
so Krupp was also famous for building large military weapons.
The project was officially named the Mammoth, but it was eventually changed to Maus, or Maus. On May 1st, 1943, Hitler was presented with a wooden mock-up of the future tank. As he was pleased with what he saw, he ordered a run of 150 Maus tanks for production. Although he ordered the version with the 128mm gun and coaxial 75mm gun, he wanted future models to be armed with the more powerful 150mm gun. The outcome of the final blueprints were 10.1 meters or 33.13 feet long, 3.67 meters or 12 feet wide, and 3.63 meters or 11.9 feet high, and it weighed almost 190 tons.
That's what I said earlier.
The crew was to consist of 6 men, a commander, gunner, 2 loaders, a driver, and a radio operator. The Maus's armor was very impressive. The turret had a thickness of 220mm or 8.7,
which is actually one of the largest, one of the biggest armors you'd have on a tank.
Inches at the front, and 200mm or 7.9 inches thick on its sides and rear. The hull thickness was 200 millimeters or 7.9 inches at the front and 180 or 7.1 inches on the side. The armament of the tank was equally impressive. The main armament was the 128 millimeter KWK-44 gun. With such a gun, the Mouse would be capable of eliminating almost any Allied tank within the range of 3,500 meters. The secondary coaxial armament was the 75mm KWK-44 gun. In addition, the turret was equipped with a 7.92mm MG.
I always thought it looked weird. It looked like it had two eyes, one big and one small.
34 machine gun for close combat. Such a heavy tank demanded a powerful engine to move it. Porsche's intention was to use the petrol-electric drive they had used before on their version of the Tiger tank. The petrol engine would operate the electric generator that drove the 24 wheels that each track had. The projected...
I don't actually know why it had an electric generator, because if that was hit, then that would mean it wouldn't work.
The speed of the tank with such an engine was 20 kilometers per hour, or 12 miles per hour. The engine system was so huge that it took 2/3 of the entire hull and caused the turret to be put at the rear end. With this design, the driver and radio operator seated in the hull were completely cut off from the turret crew. The Mouse's tracks were proportional to the overall size of the tank in order to give it good mobility.
Actually, it was very hard to escape it because of how much room the engine took.
They were 1.1 meters wide or 3.6 feet, and they were supported by a suspension system on each of the wheels. As the size of the tank was its prime feature, it was also its greatest drawback. With a staggering total weight of 188 tons, its mobility was under great question, and that was the main reason why German commanders were not fond of the concept. With a low speed and a high silhouette, the Mouse tank was a big target, especially for the Air Force. The drawback...
It was also mildly hard to move around the forces.
...of the entire Mouse concept seemed to have been obvious to the HWA, the German weapons agency, who protested against the Mouse, stating that it didn't need such a tank, and they just couldn't formulate a tactical plan for it. With such limited mobility, the Mouse couldn't serve as a tank hunter, but it could work as a mobile fortress.
Yes.
Ultimately, the Army canceled the order for 150 Mouse tanks in October 1943. In the next month, Hitler ordered the development of the Mouse to be ceased, and he believed resources could be better used for other projects. Authorities, however, allowed Porsche to continue building their prototypes. The first prototype, the V1, was produced in December 1943, although it had...
I don't think it had any guns on it, though, and the shape of the turret housing wasn't also correct.
No turret. It was equipped with a dummy turret to simulate the weight for tests. The V1 had a 1,080 horsepower Daimler-Benz MB509 V12 gasoline engine, which produced a speed of only 13 kilometers per hour or 8 miles per hour. Tests showed that the weight of the tank proved to be a great obstacle. Constructors also realized that the weight of 188 tons meant that there was no bridge in Europe that the Mouse could cross without...
Because a lot of the bridges we have in Europe are very old, and so don't actually support them. And in some parts of Europe, they actually have signs that lorries can't actually go on the bridge, saying that lorries can't actually go on the bridge. Or they have a max weight of certain ones, and some that I find is 70 tons is the max for some of these older bridges.
Destroying it. To overcome this problem, the V1 was equipped with a huge snorkel that allowed it to be submerged to the depth of 8 meters in order to cross rivers. The second prototype, the V2, came in mid-1944 and was substantially different from the V1.
Yes.
This version had a real turret installed. The engine was replaced with a 1,200 horsepower Daimler-Benz MB517 diesel engine. The V2 had an advanced electric steering system and a new Skoda gear system. All these elements, however, showed only slight improvements. Prototype tests were being...
And it still didn't really work the way that they wanted it to work.
...performed at Kummersdorf, near the Böblingen Porsche proving grounds. Tests were marked by frequent engine failures and production delays caused by Allied bombings. Finally, in August 1944, Krupp was ordered to cancel the production of the Mouse hulls and to scrap the ones already produced.
Yeah.
This was the official end of the Mouse tank project. When the Red Army units approached the Kummersdorf testing grounds in April 1945, the Germans managed to destroy the V2 prototype. The Soviets then took the V1 hull and mounted the V2 turret on top of it in order to conduct...
It was basically like a Franken tank.
...tests of their own. Today, this tank stands exhibited at the Kubinka Tank Museum. World War II tech, the Tiger I Panzer VI heavy tank. The legendary German Tiger I has a reputation as a machine feared by the Allies, combining lethal firepower and excellent armor. The need to replace
and looks brilliant. I do have to say, it looks brilliant.
The Panzer IV goes back to 1938, when several prototypes were built. In 1941, an order was placed with Henschel for the VK-36.01 with the specification of good armor protection, a powerful gun, and a maximum speed of 40 kilometers per hour, or
which is extremely fast for a tank at the time.
25 miles an hour. The tank had to be larger, and an order was placed in May 1941 for a 45-ton tank called the VK-4501. It was armed with an 8.8-centimeter gun. The deadline for the prototype would be on Hitler's next birthday, April 20th, 1942, forcing several elements of the design to be rushed. Once completed, it would be named the VK-4501H, the H standing for Henschel.
Yeah.
In competition, Porsche had created its own design, the VK-4501P, to the same requirements. With both designs meeting the deadline of Hitler's birthday, the Henschel design was selected for production, designated as the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Aus E, but eventually, the final design would use a mixture of the parts from previous prototypes by Henschel.
And actually, Porsche and Henschel design parts were used in the actual end product.
And Porsche, the Krupp turret and gun would stay the same. The crew of the Tiger tank numbered 5, including the commander, gunner, loader, who sat in the turret, and the driver and radio operator in the hull. The armor was very thick, from 25 to 120 millimeters, offering excellent protection.
Yes.
For traveling on cross-country or preparing for combat, wider tracks were fitted, improving traction. From 1943, the 55-ton tank was powered by a V12 Maybach HL230 P45 gasoline engine, providing 690 horsepower or 515 kilowatts. This was quite underpowered, and the tank had a top speed of 38 kilometers per hour,
which is just a tiny bit less than what they wanted, but still adequate enough to actually work.
24 miles per hour. One over-engineering problem with the tank was the overlapping wheel suspension, which became clogged with mud, and on the Eastern Front, this was especially dangerous as the mud froze, completely immobilizing the tank. The armament of the Tiger I was its deadly 88mm KWK-36 gun, capable of penetrating American M4 Sherman armor, and 2 MG-34 or MG-42 machine guns, one coaxial in the mantlet and the other in a ball turret within the hull. Smoke discharge canisters.
They actually used one of the largest engines in a tank ever.
Were also positioned on both sides of the turret. The Tiger I first appeared in Tunisia, North Africa in late 1942, their appearance shocking the British forces.
Yes.
They were used on all fronts, including Italy, Normandy.
It worked very well because the British and Tunisia didn't actually know how to defeat it, so they just kind of had to adapt as they knew its weaknesses eventually.
And the Eastern Front. It was only until mid-1944 that the Allies could produce tanks that could effectively engage the Tiger tank, such as the British Sherman Firefly and the Russian T-34/85. Only 1,350 Tiger Is were built, with production between August
and they go for quite expensive online.
1942 and August 1944. Other rare variants include the Befehlspanzer Tiger, which was a command tank, and the Sturmtiger, which featured a large self-propelled mortar. The Char 2C, super heavy tank. The Char 2C was designed during the latter half of the First World War in an effort to break the stalemate of trench warfare. French General Moret,
It was actually the largest tank that was going to be produced in World War I because they'd actually kind of almost gotten the design which they used in World War II. They just needed it smaller because it just didn't work as well as large as it
Secretary
was.
of Artillery granted the FCM shipyard a contract to develop a heavy tank, or char d'assaut de grand modèle, meaning great model assault tank. Although the FCM received payment for the development of the heavy tank, they failed to start basic development. Actual development would not begin until September 1916, when public interest in French tank designs rose after British Mark I's were revealed at the Battle of the Somme. When General Moret discovered the FCM had neglected the project, he took personal control over development. General Moret would come into conflict with Brigadier Estienne, who was developing the FT-17 light tank with
Yes.
Renault, and thought that his heavy tank would use up resources that could be used on his project.
And resources that should be better put towards the war, not a concept.
Estienne would go to General Joffre himself to get the heavy tank project cancelled. After the first action of a new light tank, the Schneider CA, was a disaster, Albert Thomas, Minister of Armament, cancelled all tank projects. This caused Estienne and Moret to work together, eventually getting Thomas to retract his decision. On November 17th, the first prototype of the FCM-1A was ready. General Pétain would order 300 FCM-1As. However, in 1919, with the war over, the order was cancelled and later
Yes.
replaced with an order for 10 Char FCM-2Cs. 30, 40, and 62-ton weight class variants were intended for the Char 2C. However, the end of the armistice prevented the production of these models.
And it also meant that, and because they were so large, it took so long to make them, and so many resources, that actually they were losing money on them eventually.
In post-war France, the 62-ton weight version was produced in 1921, with 10 examples in service. The Char 2C was 10.3 meters long,
It was also one of the largest tanks built before the Mouse.
meters wide, and 4.1 meters tall, or 33.7 feet long, 9.8 feet wide, and 13.4 feet tall. The armor was 45 millimeters or 1.8 inches thick at the front, 22 millimeters or 0.86 inches thick on the sides, and 6
Which is about standard for tanks of the time. You know, they weren't as sophisticated as tanks are now. Oh, look! 33 minutes and 33 seconds. That's cool.
millimeters or 0.24 inches thick on the rear, some of the thickest for a World War I era tank, but thin by World War II standards.
Yes.
It was powered with 2 Maybach diesel engines, the same type that had been used on German Zeppelins during World War I, which gave it a maximum speed of 15 kilometers or 9.3 miles per hour. The tanks were also equipped with trench
It also needed the steering wheel at the back.
crossing tails, due to the misconception that the war was going to, once again, break down into trench warfare. The armament for the Char 2C was a quick-fire, high-velocity 75mm gun located in a 3-man turret at the front, and 4 8mm Hotchkiss machine guns, one in the front, one on each side,
And the Hotchkiss machine guns were standard for the time on most tanks, but they only really had 1 or 2 on the sides.
at the back in the rear turret. The super tank housed a crew of 12, the commander, driver, gunner, loader, radio operator, mechanic, his assistant, an electrician, and the 4 machine gunners. Although obsolete by 1935 due to their low speed and high profile, all 10 Char 2Cs were reactivated and put into service as the 51st Battalion Char de Combat in 1939 to serve as a propaganda device in movies, encouraging many people to look at them as
I've actually seen some of the movies with these tanks in.
invincible super tanks and helping boost morale in the early stages of World War II. Each tank had been named after one of the ancient regions of France. Numbers 90 through 99 named Poitou, Provence, Picardie, Alsace, Bretagne, Touraine, Anjou, Normandy, Berry, and Champagne.
And as you saw, some of them actually had the flags, coat of arms of the provinces.
Instead of using them to defend against the German offensive in 1940, the French command ordered them to be shipped to the south of France by rail. However, some of the tanks had broken down and were put out of service. The others that were shipped to southern France by rail were destroyed, instead of allowing the Germans to capture them when a burning
Which makes
fuel train
sense.
blocked the railway. Number 99, nicknamed Champagne, failed to detonate, and the Germans captured it, taking it back to Berlin as a war
You can actually still see it to this day.
trophy. It disappeared in 1945 after the fall of Berlin to the Soviets, and it is suspected that it was scrapped.
Oh, I thought you could still see it.
The Maginot Line, French defensive fortifications.
I wouldn't
World
really
War
count this as a
II.
weapon. Yeah, I don't count it because it's technically a large area of military bunkers, so I wouldn't really count it.
In Dunkers, along with 1,000 French
Which
troops.
is actually why.
To become a reality, Winston Churchill, enthusiastic to
That's
defend,
actually why
circled Jeffrey Pike during the early
Germany went through
Main battle
Belgium.
within France.
ice carrier project
This is an old one.
Habakkuk, secret weapon of World War II. During the early 1940s, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships delivering vital supplies from the United States to Britain in the Atlantic Ocean. An inventor called Jeffrey Pike, working under the Combined Operations Headquarters, came up with the concept of a floating, unsinkable platform to launch aircraft from to
Pikecrete. Winston Churchill was a very big fan of pikecrete, which was basically frozen wood. And at a conference once, it was said that someone shot some wood and it shattered, and then they shot some pikecrete and the bullet actually ricocheted and hit someone else, and he absolutely loved it.
defend these convoys. His solution was an indestructible aircraft carrier made from ice. While it sounded too far-fetched to become a reality, Winston Churchill
It just melt.
enthusiastically approved the idea. Pike identified ice as the material because of shortages in steel and aluminium. It would also take less energy to manufacture.
Yes.
He drew up plans for the Berg ship. The iceberg would be leveled to provide a runway and a bridge. It would then be hollowed out inside to shelter up to 150 aircraft, fuel tanks, and living accommodation. It would be powered by an electric generator driving 20 propellers. The sheer scale of the vehicle and the thickness of its ice hull, at 40 feet or 12 meters thick, would make it
It was the thickest armor ever made, and I don't think it was actually ever made because it just was too impractical.
unsinkable. In 1943, a scale model prototype measuring 60 by 30 feet or 18 meters by 9 meters and weighing 1,000 tons was constructed to test the concept at Patricia Lake, Alberta, Canada, where the climate was suitable. The prototype, powered by a single horsepower motor, worked, surviving throughout winter and summer.
It kind of looked like some of the concept looked like a house.
However, ice as a building material could be brittle. So,
This is what I'm
Pikecrete,
saying.
named after Jeffrey Pike, was developed, which was a mixture of 14% wood pulp and 86% ice. This made it easy to work with, and it melted slower and was a stronger material. Winston Churchill, excited by the results of the prototype, ordered a full-scale ice ship to be constructed, named Habakkuk, and the Canadians confidently planned to make this happen by 1944. The project was eventually abandoned due to several reasons: rising costs and material demands on the war effort,
Yes.
its slow speed of
Wood was needed to make guns at the time.
6 knots, and the fact that Portugal had also given permission to use airfields in the Azores, a group of islands in the Atlantic. But overall, the idea was perhaps just too far-fetched. First World War tech, dreadnoughts.
As I said, dreadnoughts earlier. Now, they weren't actually really much used. They were more kind of to show off. But before the World War, Germany and Britain kind of had a little arms race, shall we put it? And because Germany was trying to build a very strong navy, and as you know, the British are still very proud of their navy, they decided to basically build whoever built the most dreadnoughts kind of won. And I think they were only really used at the Battle of Jutland near Denmark.
British Admiral John Fisher, First Sea Lord, was the driving force behind the dreadnought, a new type of warship. that made all previous ships redundant.
Yes.
HMS Dreadnought was a revolutionary design and the first of its kind when it launched. Completed
Actually, modern ships are still kind of based off it.
in 1906, the Dreadnought was heavily armed with 10 powerful 12-inch or 305mm caliber guns capable of firing accurately at long distances. Previously, the Royal Navy had battleships armed with just 4 12-inch guns, and Germany's equivalent had 4 11-inch guns. The Dreadnoughts were much larger in appearance than their predecessors due to the extra weight of the big guns and its armor plates. Yet its speed was superior, reaching a top speed of 22 knots.
Yes.
It was also the first major warship to be driven solely by steam turbines. The appearance of the Dreadnought sparked a naval arms race between Britain and Germany.
That's what I said
Soon
before.
they would be competing to build more Dreadnoughts, and by 1914 the Royal Navy had 29 Dreadnoughts, while the Imperial German Navy had completed 17. During the First World War, naval engagements were rare, which was the opposite of what was predicted based on a recent event in naval history, the Battle of Tsushima, during the Russo-Japanese War of
everyone thought that they would be more prominent, but no, tanks were seen as more prominent than ships, and they came in later.
1905. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 was the only major example, and even then sinkings were few and far between. Later in the war, a new type of dreadnought would come about, called the Super Dreadnought.
Yes.
The first of these, the Queen Elizabeth class, demonstrated superior firepower, protection, and speed.
Anyway, it's the end of the video, so remember to like and subscribe and all that. Like and subscribe to Simple History. Honestly, they do brilliant videos and you should really check them out. And yeah, bye.